Terry Etam, energy writer with the BOE Report.
Outstanding. Thank you for joining us here today. In addition to the BOE Report, your writing resume has gotten a little bit bigger. And before we get into some of the topics on hand, let's start off by The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, Clearing the Air Before Cleaning the Air. It's a book written by Terry Etam, our guest here. And talk to me a little bit about the book, the process, where it's available, etc.
Oh, sure. So the book originated, I've been writing an energy column for 4 or 5 years now, and the point of the writing I try and do is to try and shave the edges off the extremes of the debate. We've just become into such a locked, polarized debate here where there's a whole movement to kill the fossil fuel industry, and at the same time there's a fossil fuel industry that points out, well, you can't survive without fossil fuels. We can't have our standard of living without fossil fuels. And it seems like the debate's just gotten very polarized, and the extremists have taken over the stage and the microphone, and they've been talking about how easy it is going to be to get off fossil fuels. And I think the fossil fuel industry, the petroleum industry is what I speak for mostly, has kind of taken the tack that people will realize that it should be obvious how much we rely on fossil fuels. But I think people don't pay that much attention to their energy sources, particularly in urban areas. And so I think it's the battle's just gotten away from us. So this is just an attempt to explain to people who are perhaps not directly involved in the petroleum industry just how reliant we are, just try and make them understand that, and how difficult it is going to be to go to different energy systems.
I've brought up the phrase, the religion of environmentalism, because I believe that movement has turned into almost a religious type movement, to where the amount of blind faith and the amount of social causes that are really involved. It's I don't know, just go ahead and take over from there. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? Is that anything your book talks about?
I agree with that absolutely, that it's become a good versus evil thing in the minds of a lot of people. And when I say they've taken the stage, they're convincing people that it is evil to burn oil or natural gas is evil, and because you're destroying the planet. And it's an easy sell because people get scared by those sorts of messages. And it's just such a flawed argument, because it's actually what gives us life. Like, and if you look at the recent cold snap that we've had here, like in Chicago a couple of weeks ago there, like what would have happened to that city if those natural gas lines had gone down going into the city? There's actually an incident in Rhode Island. This was just before Christmas, where they declared a state of emergency because the natural gas demand was so high that it depressurized the system, and people couldn't get enough supplies. They had to cut off 7,000 customers. That's not just homes. That's not 7,000 people. That's 7,000 customers. So that could be buildings. It could be all sorts of things. And they had to declare a state of emergency. That's how close some of these communities are to a disaster. And if fossil fuel supplies were cut, never mind transportation or imagine no air travel or something like that. And I think that our industry hasn't been doing a great job of elaborating on that to people. We think it's obvious to people, but it's not. So you're right. It's become a religion, and it's become you're evil if you're on one side, and if you're good if you're on the other, even though we're the ones that keep everyone alive. So
this is a very interesting conversation, because this is the birth of the planet's champion, the champion of the planet. I've toyed with this, call it, wrestling gimmick, if you will, to almost go over the top to elaborate a point of what you just talked about. The industry does not do a good job of this, and I agree, they don't. And the one side has painted a picture of fear, like you said, and when in fact the oil and gas industry could paint a reality of fear, not a speculative fear, because I'll get into that in just a moment.
Absolutely real.
But the reality is that if fossil fuels went away at, say, 30% of what they're doing now, that would have an enormous disruption on the planet. It would have an enormous disruption on our way of life. It would have an enormous disruption on from the economy to just basically, like you said, transportation in general. So
life as we know it would change if you took 30% away from the imagine a heating source gone in winter, like I just mentioned, or not being able to transport food, or not being able to transport things by ship or air travel, any of those that you mentioned, it would just have such catastrophic consequences, but people take it for granted.
And the thing that I've always thought about, like this argument, I used to joke that I don't mind putting environmentalists on our program if they want to have an intelligent conversation. I don't mind that at all. We have a lot of oil and gas programs, as well as our non-oil and gas programs are still anchored with oil and gas, because it's that important within our economy. It's that important in our lifestyle. It's that important with our life, and we just feel that's important for people to know. So. Right. We don't mind having the opposition on. We had DAPL protesters on. They had a legitimate argument in the beginning, and then it went on by the wayside very quickly, and it turned into, like you said, a good versus evil thing, and there was no logic anymore in anything. But when they are serving me a Keurig coffee, or that sort of, like, a Keurig is one of the worst things for the environment. I mean, if you want to go behind their argument of the single serving plastic, et cetera, I just laugh at it, and I won't have them on the program because they're talking ridiculousness. Anybody who says that we need to eliminate fossil fuels really is not having a very intelligent conversation. They're just not. Now,
they're just not.
No, they're not. They're just not. There's no argument against it. I'm sorry, that's just a very factual statement. Anybody who says that they want to eliminate fossil fuels, that's an extreme, unrealistic thought. Now, let's say if they want to have a discussion on how to maybe go back to glass bottles instead of plastic, or figure something out of, those, what are those, six-pack ring holders that fish are getting stuck in out in the ocean.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what? That's a great conversation, because that, plastic bags, those ring things in plastic bottles, that would have enough of a dent to where enough people would have to shift certain parts of their life, but it wouldn't have this sweeping effect across every part of life that we know it. But I think the oil and gas industry would even be open to a conversation like that, don't you? I mean, because to me, I've seen the oil and gas industry really being the only proactive people in this. How's that for irony?
It is, and they would absolutely be open to it. And even a lot of the petroleum people I talk to downtown here, and I talk to a lot of them in the heart of Canada's petroleum business here, like, a lot of them will even say there is a date when we won't rely on fossil fuels as much. We agree with them on that. It's just that it's not in 10 years. It's going to be in 40 or 50 years, and it's going to be really, really hard to get there. And we really need to think about it and have a roadmap how to get there, rather than just saying, well, we have to stop it now, because there's no thought that goes into that. And you're right. I think some of the examples you gave there are the place to start. You go for the low-hanging fruit. Like, why aren't we tackling those things first? And I use an example in the book there. I don't know what it's like in your state, but here we have a deposit on soda cans and beer cans and stuff. You return them, you get your deposit back. Well, why don't we have that on everything? Why don't you have it on a Starbucks cup? And why don't you have it as a $2 deposit? Would you think any of those will get thrown in the garbage if you have to pay a $2 deposit on a cup? Like, it's we just need to incentivize people to act in a different way so that they stop wasting things.
No, I agree completely. Terry Etam with us. He's an energy reporter for the BOE Report, energy writer for the BOE Report. And we say writer because he also wrote a book called The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, Clearing the Air Before Cleaning the Air. And we're kind of using that as our thesis, talking about some of the issues actually in oil and gas that are going on, whether it be from a PR standpoint or whether it be from the religion of environmentalism, or just the whole misinformation that seems to be out there on a regular basis. The one that I like to talk to these activists about who want to get rid of fossil fuels tomorrow, when it comes to like cars, they like to talk about electric cars. They like to talk about wind energy. They like to talk about solar energy. And that's a frustrating conversation, because it's easier to talk to a walnut tree than it is to talk to these people, because honestly, we're coal and lithium batteries. I mean, when you start thinking about some of the things that they're saying are all the evils of fracking and mining and all these other things, their solution is a lot of times not better, if that makes sense.
No,
it's actually worse.
Right, and they take these things for granted, like you say that a electric vehicle is better for the environment. But if you pull together the web of components that go into that and the infrastructure that's required to find and mine all of those things and bring it to the assembly point, if you've ever seen the environmental disaster in China from their rare earth processing, which goes into magnets, which goes into electric vehicles, like it's just an environmental nightmare, and it's that's all part of the equation, but they don't see that. They only see the car that gets plugged into the wall, and then even the cars that get plugged into the wall, like the extremists say, well, we have to get rid of all our vehicles and go to electric vehicles, but they don't even think about that either. Like, and you can take a good example is in your house. If you plug in three things on the same circuit, you blow a breaker, right? Well, what happens if an apartment building plugs in 100 Teslas at once? Well, what breaker gets broken? Like the infrastructure that brings electricity to residential areas was not built for those kind of loads, and to think that you can just convert everyone to those new cars, it's just ludicrous. Nobody's even thought about that.
Well, and I even look at like wind, wind, and I'm not a fan of wind, and I never have been. I like windmills on farms. I think there is a great use for a personal, like smaller scale wind piece that you can maybe put on your house. I've seen some communities, they've got some vertical winds. Chicago's got a lot of them on skyscrapers. In fact, in like India and some of the foreign countries, on the medians, they'll have like wind turbines that are vertical, so that not only do you get the wind, but you get the velocity of the cars going by. So, these are some really innovative ideas. Yeah, that don't need to be these bigger than life turbines that, you have to have 50 jobs for every turbine. You know what? Sometimes those economics don't work. Those numbers just don't work. And I don't know about what your opinion is on wind, but for me, that is the one energy source that I think is probably the worst one out of all of them. I mean, I'm including coal in there and everything, because coal's made some amazing advancements when it comes to clean coal energy, that sort of thing. And I get it, they're still got a ways to go, et cetera. But to me, wind as the replacement for coal is not working out. They need to rely on natural gas, and also it's not replacing 1 megawatt of coal, is replacing 1 megawatt of wind, if that makes sense.
Right, and there's the second order circumstances that happen when you flood the market with wind power and solar power, and that's been seen in some jurisdictions where they subsidize these installations, so they pay people to put up turbines and solar farms. They generate huge lots of power. They do for a few hours a day at the wrong time of day, and that drives power prices down. And we've seen some of the established players don't want to be in the industry anymore, like the base load coal and natural gas facilities. Their business gets that much harder because they don't make as much money off the power, but they have to be there to supply power when the renewables don't. So they create havoc in the system that these people don't even think about the consequence of this. I think in 2018 in California, there was something like over 100 instances where power prices went negative because of the excess being generated by wind and solar. And so for these poor power producers that are selling into the grid at the time when that glut is coming on, they're actually losing money for having their plants operating. Well, what kind of an incentive is that, and how does that work in the long run? It just doesn't work. So,
I'm thinking, the more I'm thinking about this, I'm going to order a belt, and I'm going to start a little campaign, the planet's champion. And you know what? The belt's going to be made entirely out of petroleum products. And, because the more I'm thinking, I mean, honestly, I've been thinking that this is really backwards when the most proactive environmentalists on the planet, a lot of them truly are oil and gas companies. I honestly feel very confident saying that now. I wondered it for the last 5 years, but now I feel really confident, especially after seeing the Davis Refinery, Meridian Energy Group, the lengths that they've gone to make sure that their refinery is pumping out some clean energy, that sort of thing. And now they just did a letter of intent down in Texas, so they're going to do a second refinery now. And understanding how they have gone about making sure that the emissions and the air quality is there is absolutely amazing. I haven't heard anybody in any argument for any environmental wave ever come close to making any sort of solutionable argument or solutionable statement, if that makes sense.
No, and especially if you take in context the fact that now you can look at a place like Texas or North Dakota or the Bakken or Marcellus or wherever, and you can look at these areas and say, oh, yes, you do have a big environmental footprint. Your emissions are high. But consider why they're high. The U.S. produces 12 million barrels a day of oil, which is 12% of global energy. Just think of that for a second. 12% of global energy. Now, that has to have an environmental footprint. Anything that's 12% of the global economy is going to have a massive environmental footprint. If you take all of the iPhones that they won't live without, or their cell phones, what's the environmental footprint of a cell phone? A cell phone has 78 elements on the periodic table out of 118. They come from every corner of the earth, and they're found, and they're mined, and they're processed, and they're transported, and then refined, and then reassembled. The footprint of these things is enormous. So to single out the energy industry, who's making all this happen, it's just too absurd for words, really. But we have to do it anyways. We have to get out there and spread the message. So,
did you say the cell phone has got 78 different elements from the periodic table?
Yeah, isn't that astonishing?
That is absolutely astonishing. I've heard of the lithium in terms of being the lithium mining is one of the worst minings for the planet in terms of rankings and things like that. It's up there with the old days of the old gold and ore, where they just leave the open pits. So I understand that argument, and I've heard that a lot of the conductor wires are made from either gold, silver. A lot of them are out of silver because the amount of energy that's being conducted in such a small processor needs to be a good energy conductor, and that's why gold and silver and platinum have had value over time. And copper to some extent too, because they're good conductors of electricity and they're malleable. And so my understanding is there was a lot of silver in that, but 78, that is a lot of different elements.
I was shocked when I was researching that for the book, and I was like in disbelief too. But if you go through and look at the rare earth elements and a lot of rare components that go into it, just trace elements, but they're all necessary. I assume they're necessary. That's why they're in there.
Yeah, wow.
It's shocking, and where it all comes from. And if anyone was to, I'd like to see someone sit down and piece together the environmental footprint of a single cell phone, and that would be just astonishing, I think.
That would be amazing, actually, and I'm surprised somebody hasn't done that yet.
Well, yeah, a lot of people aren't interested in even talking about that. It's the same thing as all of the United Nations and the International Panel on Climate Change or whatever. They fill our ears relentlessly about the evils of fossil fuels, but have a look at where all of their conferences are held. They're held in Mexico. They're held in Australia. They're held in Peru. They're held in Poland. They fly every exotic location you can think of. The middle of the Pacific Ocean in Mauritius, some little island I hadn't even heard of. They go to some tropical resort there to have a climate change conference. And it's like, are you people trying to mock us? That's what it seems like to me, because they show no regard for limiting consumption, but they're more than willing to attack the people that put the fuel in the planes that keep them in the air, which to a lot of us it's just nonsensical, but that's what they do. So,
Terry Etam with us, energy writer for the BOE Report. He has a book out, The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, Clearing the Air Before Cleaning the Air. It's available Amazon.com as well as Amazon Kindle, which is Amazon.com. So just head there to buy it. And what else do we got come up? Oh, the reason why we have you on is we want to kind of do a little follow-up of an interview we did several months ago about the potential for natural gas shortages to kind of illustrate the fact that we have all this natural gas and this abundance of natural gas, but until we can find a technology to make it economical to store it, it's being wasted to the tune to where we actually have cities like Chicago, and you referenced earlier Rhode Island actually went to a state of emergency because of it. Talk to me a little bit about that, about the story that you wrote before our prediction or your prediction in our conversation, and then kind of where we're at with the Rhode Island and anybody else seeing any potential? Because in North Dakota, they've gone like 51, 52 days below zero or below freezing, and so we're getting to where we're starting to get into the cold season.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully we're on the way out. But so when I wrote that article, I was heading into fall, and we were the U.S. was heading into the lowest storage levels in decades, and winter was coming, and the low storage didn't seem to faze anyone because the attitude was that, well, there's all sorts of wells that can be turned on at a moment's notice, and so we don't need a lot of storage. And U.S. gas storage capacity hasn't really grown that much. It's grown some, but not a lot. Nowhere near what consumption has grown. So the article I wrote was like, I hope people wake up and pay attention to the possible risk here. If you did have a cold winter from, say, I don't know, beginning of December right through, if you depleted supplies, what would happen? And I'm sure some people, especially now, we made it through winter and it wasn't cold for a long time, so we're okay on the storage side. But some people might look at it and go, well, see, the system works, or that was just fear-mongering or whatever. But the point still holds, and the fact that the winter was warmer. It's been colder, like you said, for now, but before, in the earlier part of the year, when demand could be really high, we made it through okay. But the danger hasn't gone away, and then these smaller events, like you mentioned here, just point out again the how close we are to like real trouble. And in Chicago, when they had that extreme cold snap a few weeks ago, there where it got so cold, it was only for a few days. There was a compressor fire somewhere outside of Chicago, and it limited the flow. And as an emergency measure, they shut down, I think, 13 auto manufacturing plants somewhere because they were just they could shut them down, and they were such big draws of natural gas. But that's how close we are to trouble. And if you think of an apartment building, even where you live there, that had its natural gas shut off for a day in conditions like this, like what would happen to the population, and what would happen to the building with all the pipes freezing and breaking? What would it look like when you turned the natural gas back on? And if you think of like one building, that's horrible, but a whole city would be like that. And where would people go for shelter? And what about hospitals? And we hang by a thread that we don't realize it. And well, a few threads, but these are natural gas pipelines, and people just can't get that. In Vancouver, or in British Columbia, there was a natural gas pipeline that blew up in the northern part of the province, a long ways from Vancouver, hundreds of miles. And it was down for 5 days, and they brought it back up at part capacity. And Vancouver was warned when that pipeline was down. This is in October, and it doesn't get very cold there. It's like Seattle; they hardly have a winter. People in colleges and bigger institutions were warned to wear mitts and coats to classes because there was no heat in the buildings. And that was just for a few days in October. And if that happened in January, I don't know, a lot of lives are at stake here, and people just don't get that. And there is a lot of gas out there. You're absolutely right, but we've been so accustomed to it always being there that we have to think about what happens if it's not.
Well, and that's what I was wondering is what are the biggest issues? Is it the pipeline? Is it the storage? Is it a combination of things? Because we know that there's so much natural gas that they're flaring most of it.
It's being flared, yep. And a lot of the problem, I think, is the difficulty in building pipelines, which in Canada, it's extreme here. We can't get anything built. But I know you have issues down there, too, and like New York State has blocked pipelines. And that's one of the reasons Rhode Island had the emergency, is because pipelines can't be built to get them more natural gas. And everywhere you turn, it's harder to build this kind of energy infrastructure. So it can't get from the places where it's in excess to where it needs to be. So. But part of it has been just the success of these fields themselves, where everyone is now convinced that we can get the gas out of the ground as quickly as we need it, which is may or may not be true. There's a lot of booming wells, but nothing lasts forever like that. So we just have to. I think that as we get more and more, I wouldn't say addicted, but we as natural gas is used in more and more places, and more of it's exported offshore. So all of these new terminals coming on, the demand just keeps growing up, and then that just puts the risk that much higher if there ever is a big disruption.
What are you working on over at the BOE Report these days?
Just more of the same. In Canada here, I don't know if you're familiar with our situation down there very much, but it's like the country is run by Greenpeace here. We're blockaded pretty much from building any infrastructure. We can't get pipelines built to either coast. There's too much oil backing up in our province and natural gas, and there's pipelines like the Keystone XL, which was being built to haul oil from Alberta down to the Gulf Coast. That's been halted there's a Montana judge actually that's holding that up right now. And anything that the environmental activists are so strong here and so good at what they do that they put a block on pretty much anything that gets built that's of any significance. So it's very the mood is pretty downbeat here, that's for sure, just because it's hard to get anything built.
So a lot of importing for Canada then.
Well, and it comes and goes. The U.S. and Canada are like a totally integrated
right.
Oil and gas business. So there's natural gas that comes from the United States into Canada over in the eastern part of the continent, and on the western side here it tends to go the other direction. There's oil that comes into Canada over there, and it goes south here. So it's we have a lot more in common with the Midwest U.S. and the Western U.S. out here in the West than we do with Eastern Canada, who are quite a distance from us. So it's quite different, and we have the problem where all our decisions are made. Maybe you have a bit of the same in Washington, where all our decisions are made out in the eastern part in Ontario, and they look out for themselves, I guess, like any jurisdiction, but that's where the population base is, and they don't understand the resource business because they just take it for granted. It always shows up whenever they need it. So
I was having this conversation the other day with a parent. I got on one of my soapboxes about the demise of the school system and education, etc. How it seems like they're turning them more into training facilities than education centers. But whatever, that's my opinion. But what I said is that the one thing that I'm really surprised about is that they don't teach more natural resources, to have an understanding where your hamburger comes from, to have an understanding where your iPhone comes from. Because for me, I would like the school to be able to, or an education that I'm paying for, to at least have the kid know how to grow a sunflower plant when he's done. Something as simple as that. I mean, the fact that they don't even do anything like that to make these kids 10% self-sufficient, that blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind.
And it's like it's like a void of a topic that they just don't want to talk about. Like you can talk about the food chain from one end to the other, and you can talk about the biological aspects and whatever else. But yeah, where does that food come from, and how does it get there, and what's involved in the whole process, and what's required? It's just something that they just don't want to talk about. They're more as likely to talk about something like the Green New Deal, which is just like the most bizarre thing I've heard in a long time. But that's the sort of thing that gets credibility, and it's like fantasy land. It's like teaching kids that Harry Potter is a better way to plan for your future than going to college.
Well, yeah, and it's like having all this, nice wine and cheese and exotic things from Italy to have, and all this other stuff at a good price, because let's face it, the oil and gas world brought it to you at a really reduced price. And like you said, you're sitting around talking about the new Green Deal that's going to outlaw fossil fuels as you clink your wine glasses together. I mean, it's just, yeah. I don't know. I know my mind is wired like that, so I have a hard time being around situations like that.
And I think people that are involved in the resource business, that you tend to be more cognizant of these things. You go stand in the middle of a supermarket and look at all of the food around you, and just imagine what wouldn't be there without fossil fuels. Most people can't even imagine that. There's a supermarket in Germany that did this, and they just did it locally. They removed everything from the supermarket that didn't originate in Germany, and it was kind of funny to see because the shelves were almost bare. There's almost nothing in there, and they did it as a publicity thing, but people were wandering in and saying, where is everything? And the manager said, well, we're proving a point. You want what's local? This is what's local. Everything else came from somewhere else.
Right. And how much of that?
We're no different.
Well, and I wonder too, how much of that local stuff, their packaging, they probably get from out of state, and a few other things. There's an element of it.
There's an element of everything. If you look around your room, I don't care where you are in the U.S. or in Canada, look around the room and what wasn't brought to you by fossil fuels, and it's almost nothing. Even the wood that was cut down by machines using fossil fuels, that wouldn't have been cut down using solar or wind, and it was processed and it was manufactured and brought to you, and it's the materials themselves of plastic comes from petroleum, and it's almost infinite, and that's what's so, I think, been hard for the petroleum industry, is to get people to see that this isn't obvious to a lot of people. They just take it for granted.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it too. Terry Etam with us. End of Fossil Fuel Insanity is his latest book, available at Amazon.com. And he's also a BEO energy writer. And
BOE.
BOE. Sorry, what did I say?
BEO.
BEO. Okay, I must have been.
Barrels of oil equivalent.
I must have been trying to think of Bachman Turner Overdrive in my head or something. I don't know. Taking care of business. So I was kind of winding down in my head here, wrapping up a little bit. Talk to me a little bit about the process of the book. As far as you mentioned, it took about 5 years, but what are you hoping to do with this book? Obviously, you're hoping to sell it and make some money, but this is really kind of written as more of an educational book, it seems like.
It is. It's aimed at, so I had a lot of my readership, which is a lot of it is oil and gas people, but people have tended to send my stories to people outside of the business, send them to the States, send them to the coast, to people that aren't familiar with petroleum, just to say, here's a different view than what you hear from the mainstream media, because in the mainstream media you hear the shrill environmental groups, and then you hear people arguing against environmental groups, but you don't hear, there's not many voices in the middle are trying to say, here's an understanding of the way the world actually works. And there's a lot of information out there that says it, but it tends to be too dry and too boring, and people just don't listen to those things. They tune out statistics about natural gas and coal and whatever else. It's just not relevant because it's always there for them. So the book kind of arose from that, where people said, like, I wish we could get this message out to a wider audience. So that's kind of how I've written the book. I start off and I say, like, does anybody out there really think about, when you're having your breakfast, do you think about where your fork came from? Well, no one thinks about that, but if you think about it in terms of fossil fuels, you wouldn't have a fork and you wouldn't have a breakfast. And just walk people through the understanding of where their everything that they use comes from, and then just to tackle sort of in an indirect way what the Green New Deal is talking about. They're saying, well, let's just change everything. And so I just walk through some examples of, well, what does that mean to change everything? What is the actual cost of changing everything? And just one side note, like, part of the Green New Deal is that they say, well, we're going to get rid of all air travel and replace it with monorails or whatever, some rail system. And if you're just young and you don't think about the consequences of everything or the cost of everything, you might go, yeah, that's a great idea. Well, look what happened in California. They were going to build a high-speed rail link from LA to San Francisco, and even the Green governor there shot it down because the cost estimate got to $77 billion, and he said that's just outrageous. Well, now the Green New Deal people are saying, well, let's do that for the entire country, not just one of those. Let's do 5,000 of those, and so the cost of that is going to be 5,000 times 77 billion, and then you just bring this issue to people and say, that's a great idea, but what's actually involved in getting it done? And then if you just paint a few of these numbers, people will go, oh, I had no idea that was involved. So that's what I tried to do with the book, and then I tried to walk through that fossil fuels kind of are responsible for our way of life. They're not necessarily evil, and yeah, there's pollution, and we do want to get rid of pollution, and we do have to work towards a greener future, but it has to be on a time frame that makes sense without killing everyone. And then at the end, I just kind of try and give a bunch of examples that are real world. And it's like what you alluded to right at the start. Let's start with efficiency. Let's start with worrying about common sense things. And even some of the Green New Deal things, like one of the things that they promote is like, well, let's retrofit windows to make them energy efficient. That's a fantastic idea. Where it turns into a dumb idea is to say, well, we're going to do every building in the United States in 12 years. And then you lose everyone, because it's just, you're not even thinking when you say that.
We don't even have some buildings with heat yet.
That's right, yeah. So how would you go about doing that? Just the logistics of it. As soon as you say, it's the same thing as if you're 8 years old, you say, let's get rid of world hunger. Let's give everyone some food, and that's a great idea. But then when you're an adult, you go, well, it's not that easy. Or let's get rid of world poverty. We'll give everybody $1 million. Well, in 2 weeks, you'll have rich people and poor people again. And you don't, if you're naive, you don't realize that. But if you think about the consequences of things and how you change systems, especially, you realize that these things don't work. And it's the same. It's no different with getting off of petroleum. It's just going to be so much harder than people think. So I tried to illuminate that as best I could in terms and using analogies, and put in as much humor as I could too, just to try and make it entertaining for people so that they'll actually read it. Because, like I said, a lot of these statistics are out there. It's just that people don't read them because they're too dry or whatever. So.
Well, I tell you, this conversation has inspired me to do the Planet's Champion. I'm going to do that. I was mulling around in my head because I know there's a little bit of satire, a little Stephen Colbertness behind it, that whole thing. But at the same time, like I said, it's almost like the satire and the over-the-top character, if you will, is going to help prove the point that the oil and gas industry is very proactive and very green, actually.
It really is. It really is. And the oil and gas industry is used to being on its back foot and defending itself. And I think we just have to get used to going the other way and saying, no, you need to listen. We provide the world's energy, and we do it in a very, very environmentally friendly manner. Now, it's not universal. There have been mistakes, and there have been a lot of bad incidents, and there's been a lot of pollution and oil spills and whatnot. But everyone is improved upon. After the Exxon Valdez spill, which was a nightmare, there were new global standards imposed for shipping oil. And after the Enbridge spill in Michigan in 2010, there were new standards for pipelines that went out across North America. And after the BP Gulf of Mexico spill, there were new standards that went out everywhere too. So each one of these is a learning exercise, and we do act on them, and we do care about emissions, and we do try and eliminate them. Now, people can look at flaring and that sort of thing, and the solution to flaring is just building more pipelines, being allowed to do it and get it to market. So I think we have to just be more, stop being so defensive about it, and start saying, like, no, what we do provides your way of life, and there's no two ways around that. And we just need to be respected for that and allowed to progress to get to the stage that they want us to get to.
I think one of the hard parts too is that the oil and gas industry is considered one of the kings of the economy. So, they're up there with like banking and healthcare and insurance, you know what I mean? Like, as far as being huge. And they're self-sufficient though. The other two rely on the government to really operate, whereas oil and gas does not, and they don't want them around really because they actually create more problems. But it's true. And because I get it. What you said, is there was restrictions done and regulations done and this and that, and those seem to be what people talk about because it's a reaction to an event. When I think one of the biggest problems with oil and gas is how do they tell people what is being done proactively, because all anybody really talks about is the reaction stuff. Whereas,
right.
What are the recent things that they're doing proactively? I don't know how that would be receptive to the public, though. You know what I mean? Like, oh, there they are bragging again. They're kind of damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, so to speak, almost. So it's a tough dance. It's a tough chemistry set, man.
It is, but you're right. There are things that the industry could be doing, and I used to work for a pipeline company, and it used to drive me crazy because we would not talk about the safety precautions that we went through, or for example, people think that pipelines are just rusty old, like an old pipeline. They think it's just like a rusty old washing machine that you pull out of a lake that you can see through. But with pigging technology, where you send tools down the lines, you can detect external corrosion that's like fractions of an inch thick, like less than 64ths of an inch thick, and those pieces of pipe can be dug up and removed just because they know there's some external corrosion. They're not leaking or anything, but the technology to actually like maintain a pipeline is far better than anyone even is aware of. And so I don't understand why the industry can't get out ahead of some of these messages more. And when they hear somebody saying, an environmental group saying that like the pipeline is dangerous, well, bring them out there and show them what you can do. Show them the monitoring technology that you have. Show them and yes, there were mistakes made in the past, just like in lots of industries, but show them what we can do now. And or show them some of the good practices we do, where we do conserve things or reuse water. And so I think the industry could be a lot more open about things like that, and just get used to the fact that people don't realize these things, and we do need to spell it out literally for them. Here's how well we can run our shop.
You bring up a very good point, though. You bring up a very, very good point about that, which is now is the time for the energy industry to embrace public relations, because
it is
because they can use innovation. They can use innovation as their vehicle to explain why the industry is changing. And there's a short window on this. They didn't have this before. And the more, as you were talking about that, I was going, well, no wonder these old guys used to be slinging chains and they were roughnecks. And, I mean, man, go up to Edmonton and ask around about that. I mean, they're so ingrained in the culture up there. They're called the Oilers, for crying out loud. So, I mean, the industry's changed to where it is cleaner in terms of from a visual standpoint. I wrote a column once called Oil's biggest problem is Harry the Dirty Dog, was that book. We were all, as children, we were all conditioned that, hey, Harry went out and he went down the coal chute and went on the oil refinery and came back all dirty.
I read that book.
Yeah, absolutely. But think about it. I read that book 100 times, and every time it taught me that oil and gas and coal are dirty. And that's not the case anymore. That's not the case anymore.
It's not the case.
The actual tangible product is, but so is dirt.
So is dirt, and so is lots of other. There's no industrial chemical that I want poured on my breakfast cereal.
Exactly.
No different.
Exactly. So my point is that now seems to be almost like we should be shaking the industry, saying, hey guys, you got a 5 to 10 year window to do your PR for the next 50 years.
Right.
Because go ahead.
There's another aspect that people don't think of either, like, so the world consumes 100 million barrels a day of oil roughly now, and 340 billion cubic feet of natural gas. Well, if you want to shut down the North American industry, the U.S. industry, and the Canadian industry, while consumption is still climbing, and it still climbs, oil consumption goes up every year because people fly and they drive and they do whatever. If you want to shut down the North American industries, where is that product going to come from? It's going to come from Russia. It's going to come from the Middle East. It's going to come from Nigeria. It's going to come from Brazil. It's going to come from Venezuela. It's going to come from all these places that have standards that are so far inferior to ours that we don't even understand it. I talked to a guy the other day who did some work in Africa, and he told me about how the effluent and the waste and the drilling mud that's just pumped straight out into the ground. And it's that happens. And if that's happening in Russia, do you think anyone knows that, or is that reported on? But in the U.S. and Canada, we're open and people can see what we do, and we get hung for that because we're transparent. Mm-hmm. And that's not right. We have better standards, and we let people look in, and we show them our dirty laundry, and we say, yeah, here's all the problems. And then they say, well, that's unacceptable. And we say, yeah, that's true, but we can make it better, and we work to make it better. The other side of the world is going to produce the oil for us, and they don't necessarily care at all about the environment. And you can't validate any of their claims. So I think people need to start thinking about that too. Where do you want your energy to come from? Do you want it to come from a local source where you can control it and you can have a say in the environmental impact? Or do you want it to come from the other side of the world where you have no idea?
Boy, the planet's champion just got another idea. I mean, all you local source people are the ones beating down how we need to get rid of fossil fuels. We need to just go with local energy, right? I mean, how come they're not going with local energy? Why do they want, Russian energy? Why do they want Lithuanian energy? Because you're right. If they make these changes in the U.S. and Canada and Mexico, of course they're going to import in energy. Of course they're going to.
And it's going to come from wherever. It's going to come from Nigeria or Libya or Iraq. Like what's the environmental footprint of producing oil in Libya? No one even knows. And it's
these environmentalists are ruining the planet.
They are.
I mean, you can't make it up. It is George Orwell warned us, and we're living in it. And the environmentalists are ruining It's time for. I got to order that belt, the planet's champion, man. I got to make sure the trademark's available on that. I'm telling you what, man. The keynote speech. I'm already seeing it in my head at an oil and gas conference, and I'll bring the belt and everything. It's gonna be like a WWE belt, man. It's gonna be awesome. with diamonds and gold and oh yeah.
Take on all comers.
Oh, this is gonna be great. You get a picture with the planet's champion and everything. All right. Well, all right. We got one of the hardest working journalists in the business, energy writer, BOE Report, and also he's a writer as well, an author. Actually, author would be the correct term. I'm big into trying to be impeccable with my word.
Oh, you're nailing it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's there's a reason we have different words for this. A writer and an author are actually different.
They're different things.
Yeah. So okay, just kind of wrapping up here. How can people make you some money? Give a plug for your book, and then also your energy writing and that sort of thing.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. The book. I think it's just. There's a essential conversation that needs to happen here because we're so polarized and it's almost become political and certain elements like the Green New Deal they want to make petroleum political and politics, nothing gets resolved. Socialists and capitalists are never going to agree, and I think energy should not be like that because it's critical to our existence. And so my book is a arrow aimed right at the heart of that gap, and I want average people to be able to read it and then come away with a new appreciation for what it costs to live the way we live, and an appreciation for how difficult it's going to be to change. And I don't dismiss the environmental concerns. I say they're necessary, and we need a greener planet. And but we just have to do it in the right sequence. I guess that would sum it up.
And how can people access your writing, your reporting?
I'm as an author. My book is on Amazon.com. It's The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, and then my writing is I write a pure oil and gas column for the BOE Report, and then I also write an energy column on my own website, which is called Public Energy Number One, and that's a bit more broadly focused. Where I'm just it's an extension of the talking to the general public theme, where I try and make these things a little bit clearer. I write articles there about exactly like you say, like environmental extremists can be very bad for the environment because they force this polarization, and then you get people that act contrary to the way that they might otherwise act because they're offended by the Green New Deal or something, and so they act against it when it's not. You shouldn't act against it. You should say that doesn't make sense. But we should still focus on the environment. And if you're making the debate political, you're not focusing on the environment anymore. You're focusing on the politics of it, which is what the United Nations is really bad for. And so I think my book and my writing is just an attempt to pull people away and separate the two and say energy is energy and politics is politics. And you go fight your political wars, but we need to secure our energy supplies.